Tonight's topic will be solitary confinement, problems and alternatives. Welcome.
Thank you, Frankie. Thank you for coming on a cold night. I live in Arizona now, 93 degrees. So thank you for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit, kind of freelance about solitary confinement, lay down some basic concepts that I have, feelings I have, findings I've had, and try to make this interactive. Particularly, this is a good room for this, and it's a small enough group. So I'd like to kind of hear what you have to say, or maybe hear what questions you may be coming into the room with. You may all start, you know, it's hard to know where people come from. I don't know how much you know. You know what I mean? We don't have a shared information base. It's not like a class. So I don't want to make too many assumptions about it. And I think it's a lot better than just listening to somebody for an hour. If we could just talk, and I can use your questions, your observations as a takeoff point. I always do this. I get nervous when I'm going to talk, so I write all these damn talks out, and then I never use it. And I don't even know. I'm kind of confused about what I have in front of me here. But what I did just finish, this thing, it's called a white paper, National Institute of Justice. They're doing a series called White Paper Series. So they retained me to do a paper that is titled Restrictive Housing and Legal Issues. And so if it's not in my head now, I guess it's not going to be in my head. I'm trained as a lawyer. You know, I'm not a practicing lawyer, but my whole background is in law. And law, it's always law and psychology. When I went to Yale, it was law and mental health. And so I bring that perspective, and I don't say that as an excuse, but just as a way to say it's what gives me some of the breadth, I think, but also it's limiting. You'll see, because whatever is wrong with restrictive housing or solitary confinement, you'll see a lot of different terms are used for it, and there's a lot wrong with it. The remedies that are being fashioned to reform what I see as torture, a form of torture, are coming from the courts. I mean, the executive branch take care that the laws are enforced. The legislative branch is where this would be much better off approach, I think, because you can just do policy so much better. But it has been the courts and the Constitution that's been the basis for whatever reform we have. And there's quite a bit of it going on in solitary confinement. There's so many different terms that are used for it. I actually prefer the term penal solitude for a lot of different reasons, but it hasn't caught on. But I'll go up and back. I may say segregation, I may say segregated restrictive housing or so on, but I'm talking about the same thing, and I'll eventually try to identify what I mean by it. It's not, certainly locking somebody up per se, even harshly, is not torture. So what do I mean by torture? I ought to get to that in the point. Let me start out anecdotally a little bit. In 1995, I was appointed by the federal court in Ohio to be the monitor over the whole prison system for mental health services. That meant that a case had been brought, the charge had been made, that under the Eighth Amendment there was deliberate indifference in the provision of structurally mental health care in the Ohio prisons. They had 40,000 prisoners and 6.6 psychiatrists, I remember, and a handful of nurses when we started. But what does that have to do with solitary confinement? Well, when I started to, when you monitor, I'm not a clinician, so I assemble a team, psychiatric nurse, a psychologist, a good psychiatrist, and then I served as the team leader. And one of my functions as team leader, when you monitor to see that this settlement agreement is enforced, is I kind of freelance. You know, the clinicians sit there with the records, and they may interview him. I would walk around the prisons and sort of freelance and see what I can just find out about what's going on with the services. And I quickly learned that if you go to solitary confinement or restrictive housing or whatever it may be called, the place where inmates are locked down, that's where you're going to find the mentally ill. And so when people talk about, you've heard this term that the prisons are the new asylums. If that's true, then to the extent that we're talking about segregation units, they're the new high security mental health wards in effect. And that's not just a metaphor, that's true. And I came up with a technique. I would go up to the sergeant who's running the unit for the day or the shift, and just look at my watch and say, God, I'm in a hurry. I wish I had more time. I'm a lawyer. I don't know anything about mental health. I know, you're not an expert in mental health, so help me out. I just want to see how many mentally ill people you have down here. So when they say, oh, okay. So I've accomplished a couple of things right away. I didn't say, do you have any mentally ill people here? I said, how many do you have? And I'd say, just help me out, save me some time. He said, oh sure. The Smith, Jones, Abel, and Herman. And I'd say, okay, where are they? Just, okay. I said, I want to go talk to them. Then I would stop at the first cell where there's somebody awake, not drugged up, not screaming at me, not throwing excrement around. And I would say, I'm the federal court monitor. Yeah, we know. They know when you're coming. So who are the craziest guys in the place? That's what I said. They'd say the same thing. I mean, so they knew. And you established a grid, and then all I would have established is reasonable grounds, not any certainty that these are mentally ill, but to take my clinical staff and have them look at the records and see, in effect, if the diagnosis is in there, if there is treatment being provided. And so I came to see how horrible the situation was, particularly for inmates that had a diagnosis of seriously mentally ill, or something, on the borderline, where they were more vulnerable to conditions like they were experiencing to become seriously mentally ill. And my interest in segregated confinement really kind of spread out from that. My base was trying to see if mentally ill people in prison are receiving treatment. Under the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution, since Estelle versus Gamble, 1966, under the Eighth Amendment, there is it's a multifaceted amendment, but including bail. But it says, shall not engage in cruel and unusual punishment. That's where we start from. That's where the right to treatment begins for people who are convicted of crime. Pretrial detainees have a due process right to treatment for doctrinal reasons that we don't have to go through, because they haven't been convicted yet. The Eighth Amendment applies only when you've been convicted. So your right to treatment and your right to a safe environment, the critical point, flows from the Eighth Amendment. Cruel and unusual punishments cannot be inflicted. And so this entire judicially based, stimulated reform movement for the for persons who are confined in certain forms of deep-end solitary confinement starts in the courts. It's probably going to end in the courts, and it flows from the Constitution, and it takes place in the courts. And there are all kinds of formalities, formal rules here that go along with evidence and people having standing to sue, and class actions and individual actions. That there's certainly no time to go through here. But a legislative hearing, for example, on getting rid of solitary or modifying it is not restricted by rules of evidence or anything of that sort. You listen to the best testimony or the best evidence you can get. I gave testimony before a Senate committee, Dick Durbin's committee. And it was the first time that the Senate had ever conducted hearings on solitary confinement. And I had just completed a study under a court order in Illinois. We looked at 8 of the prisons on asking our opinion on the constitutional level of services provided in the Illinois prisons, and our report said it was about as bad as we have ever seen. The only state I'd ever seen that was worse was Alabama. So here's Dick Durbin, a great liberal senator, conducting hearings and taking all kinds of applause, and we're sitting on a report that's under court seal. It can't be distributed. The parties agreed to that, where we have said it's the worst, one of the worst. And if you've ever been to an Alabama prison, you can imagine to say that it competes with Alabama in terms of how horrible the prisons are. We saw people. I did work with the Southern Poverty Law Center in the Alabama prisons, and the 6 craziest people I ever saw in a prison were confined in the Alabama prisons in a what resembled a container, a metal container that they use on ships, with a light, a bulb, a naked bulb dropped in, and a little slit. And they were floridly psychotic. I mean, in their own excrement. So just beginning to talk about how horrible the situation can be. We don't know exactly how many people in the United States are held in solitary confinement. The best estimates are somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people on any given day are held in solitary confinement, some form of solitary confinement in the United States, not counting juveniles in the juvenile system. It's a lot of people. Now, for me to condemn solitary confinement, as I've just done, is torture, and not describe more exactly what I mean by that, it would not be doing you a favor. So there's different. New York, when I was here, they have something that qualifies as restrictive housing. Keep lock. You're written up for a ticket. You're waiting a disciplinary hearing, and they make you stay in your own cell until you have the hearing. So it's like being denied bail on the outside. Nobody gets to. That's not torture. It's a temporary measure, and you're in your own cell. On the other hand, there's an inmate in the federal system named Jack Silver.